Conjunct zurkse president Yarmuk rocks. Plahib to duk geschwingt de groep zerige geschapswoord shatte. Wat de bakker het dikke Joshua de donk, wisselike trappen chongshi kete our ukshorps nintuk. Oi groep zorg Perez president, pochiaka chatche kemanshi, homonke sharp shiz roy. It was Rick Rat truppe oi arkwiki. Aye. Which was a young paniket, dan shar I om mapik daart, tuk zich uit Tzoirytzu perschwacher. Schirau tinas pejisri pekone, je meent zich uit wachin lankjaard. Turk zeg tatuk, charger gooit capital goedjon, kijk het troip kar, gebrinde kip zennige titter igenat songsja hutzon, je ters chart keraz, tro etoi il goed rebukte arch, bent tuko al je tjaart dikikshi. Piek das tutuks, perkte port trorips, Pacific Zians, kishetap kishemong, sitashi richahu, kishetap kinsochi, azufirmong reputin long. Torchers chart perkakjai, pero she's root to monk chashut zaihuts, ut gewoon kish hart die mond kajakische, je truks gechahu tamakint. Tu chikwat stuk, psitiche prietje zort. Je shasha gorket, rippe jats ach, psi rapik och, je proi pais tukigrach, trotuks ater begin. Wap zamene si, ip onor ki jaip is itach shak, kemunch pshisri, pershetau trap on level zon ik shangers, ik Labour Party si chutzon. In dat Zachari Shashar, Pekrats Tutsi Komunuk Zonro, Riki Persh Tzoirytzu. That excerpt I just read was the conclusion of a speech delivered on August 18, 1970 by Councilman Jordo Allspice in the town of Jeju Beach on the Pacific coast of the small Central American nation of Zeyrreston. At the time, Zeyrreston had undergone a revolution a little over a year prior. Mismanagement at the hands of USA-based steel mining operations had long fomented tensions in the Jeju region, culminating in a major mine explosion in 1967, responsible for the so-called Jeju Zone of Delusion. This veritable Chernobyl of the Americas, an ensuing anomaly, served as the final impetus for the militarization of the Zeyrrestonic Labour Party, which executed a decisive coup against the former US-backed presidency alongside Cuban and Yugoslav forces. Since then, Zeyrreston has undergone a radical transition to a one-party system and a planned socialist economy directed by the Ministry of Tourisme and Harkertson, or TYT. In a historic move, the new regime sought to publicize its decrees in 4 separate official languages: Spanish, English, Zeyrrestonic Creole, and last but not least, Tzoirytzu. This last inclusion was a key political move. Even though it maintained a speech community of several hundred thousand, Tzoirytzu had been a minority language for centuries, and an unlikely pick for dominance in the urban capital of Ablinger. However, as the disaffected mining towns near Jeju constituted the language's main geographic stronghold, Tzoirytzu came to be something of a revolutionary argot, with a reputation for roots in the Labour Party's heartland. Tzoirytzu's revival became emblematic of revolutionary fervor, and today maintains significant influence in national iconography and propaganda. Of course, detractors of the regime claim that Tzoirytzu is actually a Conlang. Some even believe that I'm the one who made it, but I wouldn't trust them. Typologically speaking, Tzoirytzu has a number of unique features that distinguish it from European languages as well as its indigenous neighbors. For one, it is a low lexical verb language, using a closed class of around 40 verbs in independent clauses and around 60 in dependent clauses, which combine with uninflecting coverbs to form complex, multi-word predicates. As a side note, I'll be using the terms absolute verb and conjunct verb to refer to the closed class verbs throughout this video. I'm loosely borrowing these terms from the Celtic languages, since absolute verbs in both Tzoirytzu and Gaelic varieties only occur at the starts of sentences, while conjunct verbs are shorter and occur elsewhere, but take this comparison with a big grain of salt. Tzoirytzu is also highly non-concatenative, strongly head-marking, and lacks all forms of personal pronouns and adpositions. Before we get into the nuances of how the grammar works, though, we'll first need to talk about the phonology. At first glance, the basic consonant inventory of Tzoirytzu seems simple, with 11 underlying basic consonants and notably lacking any phonemic nasals. Tzoirytzu's sole rhotic sound originated from a merger of several true pharyngeal sounds in earlier stages of the language, but today is transformed into a so-called bunched R. You'll recognize the sound as the heavy unrolled R sound characteristic of Southern American English, where it is a combination of light pharyngealization and retroflex rhoticity. Coupled with other consonants, it often adds something of an emphatic or backed pronunciation. Tzoirytzu's underlying vowel system is also, at first glance, simple, with 4 vowels and a lot of allophonic wiggle room. There's also a few diphthongs. Phonotactically, the Tzoirytzu syllable template looks something like this. What this means is that while consonant clusters are frequent, they all adhere to a strict sonorants hierarchy within the same syllable: stops first, then fricatives, then approximants. What's more, many prefixes that end in consonants metathesize to preserve this sonorants hierarchy, although this does not occur in compound words, which are more content to keep syllables separate. However, there's a big catch to everything we just discussed, which you probably noticed in my examples. All native words in Tzoirytzu are subject to one of 3 phonation classes. oral, nasal, or rhotic, which are harmonic within native morphemes. To break down the phonation classes a bit, oral class vowels tend to be more tense and don't change the consonants. Nasal class vowels are, well, nasalized, but also tend to be more lax. In addition, intervocalic stops are realized as nasal consonants in between these vowels. Rhotic class vowels are both rhotic as well as somewhat centralized. This also frequently backs consonants into uvular or pharyngeal equivalents. Phonation distinctions in Tzoirytzu are very important, with many minimal pairs distinguished on class alone, and many affixes reassigning harmony both progressively or regressively. Add a couple of loan sounds that have become all but naturalized, and the actual phonetic inventory of Tzoirytzu is far larger than its underlying one, looking something like this. Tzoirytzu doesn't have a native writing system, and we don't have time to get too deep into the orthography that it uses to represent all these sounds, but it suffices to say that official spellings were only standardized after the Labour Party coup. This controversially chose to mirror Hispanicized conventions seen in the earliest post-Conjunct sources, rather than drawing from Americanist notation, which was seen as problematically Anglocentric. All these phonological shenanigans we just covered have a tendency to obscure the nature of Tzoirytzu's grammar, which relies substantially on phonation alternations and consonant mutations. In order to see what's going on under the surface, we're going to need to have a bit of a history lesson. Generally speaking, Tzoirytzu has undergone at least 4 main periods of change, defined by both diachronic evolution and extensive contact with other linguistic groups. Proto-Wichita-Charzakuzan, otherwise known as PUC, was likely spoken near Lake Osa thousands of years ago, and is the reconstructed ancestor of virtually all languages native to Zeyrreston. Tzoirytzu is a member of the Charzakuzan branch of its descendants, spoken further south around 500 CE. In the transition to Old Charzakuzan, PUC underwent a transition from a 4-way tonal system to a stress-based system, which in turn made most inflections far more fusional and unpredictable than once had been. We'll cover the details and further evolution of the system later, but for now we can concentrate on nouns, which are generally easier to parse. The vast majority of Tzoirytzu's vocabulary consists of nouns, which are mainly of native origin, but also include significant amounts of loans from European and West African sources. Noun inflection isn't too complex. For one, Tzoirytzu does not have any form of noun case or overt role marking, instead using a strict verb, subject, object, word order. Notably, however, all verbs are ambitransitive in Tzoirytzu, which means that it is often unclear whether 2 adjacent nouns represent a subject and object, or 2 subjects acting without an explicit patient. This means that any adjacent nouns must take the coordinating prefix r, similar to the English and if they occupy the same role. Note that this prefix has a few different allomorphs, contracting before vowels and other rhotics. Tzoirytzu nouns also occasionally inflect for number, with a simple split between singular and plural. However, only about 30% of Tzoirytzu's nouns still have distinct plural forms, and those that do use a variety of inconsistent strategies to mark it, including suffixation, depalatalization, or rhoticization. Tzoirytzu also uses a wide range of common derivational affixes on its noun roots, many of which are suppletive based on number, regardless of whether or not the root itself changes. The most important and most complex feature of Tzoirytzu nouns is possession. Tzoirytzu is both canonically head marking and head initial, so possessed nouns proceed and agree with their possessor. Tzoirytzu features 3 distinct possession classes, which deserve some individual mention. The first is the simplest and constitutes most cases of direct ownership. Here, possessed nouns agree in both person and number with their possessors. It's worth noting that final consonants and possessive prefixes frequently metathesize to preserve the sonorants hierarchy. The second class is more complex, and is used for certain basic vocabulary such as body parts and kinship relations. These prefixes use one set for alienable possession and one for inalienable possession. It's worth noting that while most possessives are simple prefixes, the first-person inflections of second-class possessed nouns are notably irregular, and frequently include so-called broken possessives that cause substantial root mutation. This class also utilizes a third alternation for irrealis or counterfactual possession, whose use is variable but often indicates desire or aspiration, or involves coupling with negative constructions. The second class of prefixes is also used for the majority of adjective-like nouns. Tzoirytzu lacks adjectives as a distinct morphological category, and virtually all words that are considered adjectives in English inflect as nouns in Tzoirytzu. These prefixes have implications for the meaning of adjective-like nouns. You can see these lexical implications in action here with the root upzin. The third possessive class consists of relational nouns. Tzoirytzu has no adpositions whatsoever, but spatial and temporal relations can still be conveyed by applying a relational possessive prefix to a conventionalized set of nouns. The relational prefixes can also be supplemented by a set of hither and thither clitics to entail motion to or from a location, rather than simply sitting at a point. Tzoirytzu has many expressions that work like this, with most body parts as well as many environmental and other terms having consistent adposition-like meanings when assigned a relational possessive prefix. Now, onto the verbs. As I mentioned earlier, Tzoirytzu has a pervasive split between absolute and conjunct verbs, but in order to understand this distinction between the two classes, it's worth explaining some more history. It was around 500 CE that the civilization of Tzoirytzu, from the Tzoirytzu term Tzoirytzu, really started to come into its own. From its homeland in the interior swamps of southern Zeyrreston, the Tzoirytzu cultural region began to grow dramatically in the coming centuries across much of the Pacific coast. Rather than consisting of a unified empire, however, Tzoirytzu largely comprised small, discontiguous coastal outposts, which thrived due to advantageous trade positioning as well as militaristic raiding against the more established, sedentary cities of Mesoamerica. These outposts were governed under a system of Tzoirytzu councils, small coalitions bound either by city-state affiliation or cross-geographic trade agreements, and were managed under a meritocratic republican government system. By the height of the council's eminence, multilingualism among the pluralistic and mercantile population was common. As such, learning older forms of classical Tzoirytzu became extraordinarily difficult due to the high prevalence of opaque inflection. Rather than opting to regularize morphology, the language of the councils began to radically alter its syntax to avoid overuse of inflectionally opaque verbs, as well as to accommodate a rapid influx of loanwords and influence from non-native speakers. What we are left with today is a repertoire of around 40 absolute verbs, although the exact number varies based on dialect. Often, the meaning of each verb is semantically vague and left up to context, clarified by the following nouns, as we can see here. Adding a third nominal argument can further refine meaning, but the role of this noun is in fact lexically determined by the verb. Here, the verb shechash prescribes that any noun listed after the subject and object is a beneficiary, and thus no additional marking is required to understand that his family is the recipient of the chicken wings. Meanwhile, the absolute verb pepak means essentially the same thing, to make or to prepare, but entails an instrumental meaning. These kinds of ambiguities and overlaps between absolute verbs are common. As you can imagine by their frequent and vague use, they also tend to be irregular in their conjugations, which inflect based on telicity, subject-person, subject-number, 3 tenses, and 3 aspects. These forms are highly fusional, and their exact mechanics are quite complicated. And moreover, no single absolute verb in current use adheres to any of these tables exactly. So, it's more useful to reduce all this to just a few key components. 1. A prefix expressing a mix of tense and telicity. 2. Initial root consonant mutation for subject-person marking. And 3. A split between 3 aspects based on vowel template alternation. These aspects often have a substantial lexical component, particularly when paired with telicity distinctions, and may be translated as different words in English. There's also 7 absolute verbs which are almost completely separate from this system, which include an attributive copula ru, casual linker tux, and 5 distinct verbs of exchange, which conjugate based on the physical properties of the thing being exchanged rather than conventional person marking. It's worth noting that these verbs of exchange also conceive of the exchanged good as their subject, and so appear inherently passive to English speakers. Absolute verbs can also take a number of affixes. First are what are called modal prefixes, which usually express verbal mood, but occasionally have more logical or evidential implications. These can coexist with each other and chain to substantial lengths. Remember the examples about the chicken wings? Since absolute verbs tend to prescribe the role of their unmarked indirect objects, Tzoirytzu also makes use of a number of applicative suffixes to change what third nominal arguments do. Here, we can swap the indirect object with an instrumental suffix, or a benefactive suffix, essentially swapping the 2 sentences. There's also a more general passive suffix, which switches the subject and object roles, or a middle voice suffix, which can be used for reflexive or reciprocal actions. These constructions are important because communication in Tzoirytzu strongly favors that in any sentence, the subject of the absolute verb is also the topic of discussion. This can result in wordings that are quite clunky to English speakers, but natural for native Zeyrrestonics. Literally, to Annette and his family fish are taken by Juan. This preference to highlight topics as the subject of absolute verbs also applies beyond the scale of a single clause. Understanding how this works, however, brings us to the next category of verbs, conjunct verbs. Conjunct verbs can be used for 3 distinct functions: modifying the meaning of absolute verbs, introducing subordinate clauses, and introducing relative clauses. First off, conjunct verbs can be listed after absolute verbs, or occasionally next to each other, to refine lexical meaning. These cases I call complex predicates, since more often than not, a specific verb in English is expressed using a pairing of absolute and conjunct verbs in Tzoirytzu, rather than as a single word. The aspect of the absolute verb also plays a role in the complex predicate's meaning, and in such cases, most conjunct verbs change their form a bit to agree in aspect too. There are many potential effects of the complex predicate pairing system, and we don't have time to list them all in one video, so I'll just go through a brief survey of some interesting ones. Meanings which are considered antonyms in English are often distinguished not by verb choice but by conjunct pairing in Tzoirytzu. For example, the absolute verb tish means both to be born or to die, with polarity being determined by the conjunct verb, and similar cases occur throughout the lexicon. Some conjunct verbs are also semi-grammaticalized, such as parats, which makes anything imperative or urgent, or ksump, which prefaces comparative claims. Other notable interactions include statements of weather, which involve pairings of first-person perception and sensation, or color words, which involve both brightness and saturation descriptors based on verb pairings, which then take physical objects as predicates to specify value. Admittedly, all these constructions are usually just European loads today, but historians and publications from the TYT still like the older, more poetic forms. Now, conjunct and absolute verbs can pair, yes, but conjunct verbs can also exist on their own in subordinate clauses. Remember that table of PUC inflections from earlier? What I didn't tell you before is that what appear to be tense prefixes are actually temporal auxiliary verbs. In PUC, these auxiliaries were heavily associated with complete clauses, but could be dropped elsewhere. In such cases, the subject-person marker could be attached directly to the lexical verb instead, giving us these simpler forms, which, due to influence from other Isthmo-Colombian languages, have now been reanalyzed as switch reference markers. This means that if the conjunct verb is the same subject as the absolute verb, it uses a base form, which is identical to the form used if it serves as a modifier, and is only distinguished by word order. However, if the dependent clause is a different subject, it must mark for a separate person, although not number. In many dialects, there exist two separate forms of different subject markers in the third person, one that is used for when the subject of the dependent clause is the object of the main clause, and one for if the subject of the dependent clause is some other argument entirely. Switch-referenced conjunct verbs can be also used in relative clause constructions, wherein the conjunct verb takes the prefix ki and follows the noun it modifies. There are also a number of other conjunct modal prefixes as well, which overlap with those used on absolute verbs but often take on alternative subordinating meanings. All of these strategies of conjunct verb use ultimately serve again the purpose of foregrounding topics as the subjects of absolute verbs, allowing focus to be maintained across the scale of multiple chained clauses. The entire verbal system has a way of generally making syntax explicit, but lexical meaning vague, which is something I've always found interesting as a foreign learner. That being said, you can't get everything solely out of context, which brings us to the last main part of speech, coverbs. These are simple modifiers that usually don't inflect at all, but can be listed after all types of verb complexes to assign specific meanings. In classical Tzoirytzu, most coverbs were transparently derived from nouns. Many were zero-derived, but several derivational affixes, the same type that we mentioned earlier with suppletive plurals, could also suggest a coverbal meaning, not all of which are still consistent today. Keep in mind that while I'm translating these as verbs, they are in fact coverbs, and thus require a head absolute verb to make sense in a sentence. None of these coverbal derivation suffixes are still productive in the present day, and most are conceived of as a lost pre-colonial feature. Today, coverbs are instead the main place where loan vocabulary in Tzoirytzu tends to end up. In fact, over 70% of all coverbs in contemporary use, many of which blur the line with zero-derived nouns, are of European origin, albeit most often indirectly through highly creolized forms. Modern Tzoirytzu has thus become extremely fond of generating new derivations by inventively pairing static foreign origin coverbs with different inflectional absolute verbs. In some sense, modern Tzoirytzu's native verbs can now be viewed as different buckets into which lone coverbs can be placed. Using conversar from conversar as an example, we compare an essentially meaningless absolute verb, an absolute verb similar meaning, absolute verbs of a number of lexical domains, or absolute verbs of a number of more abstract modal domains to create a whole gamut of meanings. Of course, all of these could also be paired with conjunct verbs instead in a subordinate clause. Since most of these expressions can also be conveyed using a more native absolute conjunct or absolute noun pairing, what we end up with is a situation ripe for diglossia. As Tzoirytzu came to be known as the working people's language, the Tzoirytzu et Harkertson made the ironic choice to establish an official Tzoirytzu language authority, which was tasked with codifying a standard form of the mainly oral language for government communications. However, the TLA was too wrapped up in nationalism for their own good, as its 1970 standards consistently favor highly nativist constructions over those with more loading and more actual use. After all, nativist Tzoirytzu, devoid of Spanish influence, had not been widely spoken in hundreds of years. By the 50s and 60s, it was the domain of urban intellectuals and upwardly mobile cosmopolitan Zeyrrestonics, who intentionally sought to revive the language as a statement against the USA's puppet regime, and had the resources to reconstruct vocabulary based on limited colonial accounts. Meanwhile, heavily loaned Tzoirytzu is still more common in the rural and lower-income southern lowlands, where it blends substantially with Zeyrrestonic Creole, a testament to linguistic blurring that has persisted uninterrupted since the days of European contact. It was not until the early 1900s that this linguistic area was urbanized at all. Its swampy terrain developed under the oversight of American real estate moguls in close dialogue with concurrent growth in Florida. So, despite the TYT's nominally socialist rhetoric, its interpretation of the Tzoirytzu written standard is deeply flawed. It is nevertheless caught on among urban speakers, which gives us a fairly clear split between northern or urban Tzoirytzu, which includes nativist and English-derived vocabulary, stronger pharyngeal pronunciations, and less vowel reduction, and southern or rural Tzoirytzu, which includes Spanish and West African-derived vocabulary, stronger rhotic pronunciations, and widespread vowel merging. There's one major topic left to talk about in Tzoirytzu, and it's the topic most inextricably linked to this regional divide. In the start of the video, I mentioned that Tzoirytzu has no personal pronouns. This is, by all modern accounts, true, as no standalone pronouns remain in use and verbal person marking is mutation-based. In light of this, Tzoirytzu makes use of a widespread and robust system of open-class honorifics to refer to people in discourse. A bit similar to Japanese, these honorifics are syntactically nouns and can take all nominal inflection, and none of them are truly neutral in connotation. The exact mechanics of Tzoirytsu's honorific system are complex enough to warrant a video of their own, but I'll mention some key points. Among adults who interact repeatedly while maintaining social distance, such as in workplaces or community organizations, a wide range of trade-based honorifics maintains frequent use. Originally, these terms were heavily associated with membership in mercantile guilds, which served as the primary lower-level organizational structures in Tsarskusan society. Many of these terms have been supplemented by Soviet-inspired imagery of industrial solidarity, which has often been used to deliberately supplant older, more hierarchical expressions. Some honorific terms are also explicitly unique to residents of certain geographic areas or ancestral lands, or have been recently reinterpreted in celebration of newfound urban development. Note that the term Eharkor, the light of the night sky, is also conceived of as a general emblem of Zeyrrestonic progress, and is very common in 70s Labour Party iconography. A number of such terms are also associated with private initiatory societies, whose methods of admission are deliberately kept unknown due to cultural taboo significance, specific eligibility for ceremonial knowledge, or classified information within the Labour Party's leadership. This last category includes epithets such as Omampikit and Ochenes. Thanks for watching. Zeyrreston is a multimedia novel including zines, videos like this one, and interactive fiction. Continue the story and keep up with new updates either at this YouTube channel or on Blue Sky. There's a lot more to come, so I'll see you soon.